All right, if you haven't already, I invite you to open your Bibles back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And today we're going to begin by looking at the passage that begins in verse 17. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 17. This will be our last class, I'm anticipating, on the subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. This is lesson number 6 on this particular subject. But of course, our greater subject here is the letter of 1 Corinthians, and we will continue to move on with this letter even after we move out of the subject of marriage and divorce. I will be happy to move on to a little less controversial topics. Now, I will say chapters 6 through 8 was actually, which will be what we're going to study next, was actually quite controversial whenever it was written at the time that the Apostle Paul put this together. And the question that is addressed in those chapters is, how do Christians live in a society where idol worship is everywhere? And in particular, it is addressing the question of what do you do with food that has been a part of a sacrificial ritual in a pagan temple? And that's, I know, not a terribly pressing issue to you. When you go to Dillon's or wherever, you're not thinking about, I wonder which pagan temple this meat was sacrificed at. We all know that it was Cisco and or whatever else. And so it's always easier to talk about someone else's controversy than it is to talk about your own. But marriage, divorce, and remarriage is a controversial subject. It was so in Paul's day. It remains so in our day. And the reason why is because life and marriage is just difficult. And the teaching that comes from the Bible about this particular subject is quite strict and hard. And so the question is, how do we live with some of these things? How do we take it seriously on the one hand, but yet not crush people from the law? All right, so here's just kind of a quick summary of what we have learned over the last 5 weeks. In order to understand what Paul teaches here in this section, we went back to study the broader subject of marriage in the rest of your Bible. And we learned what the Old Testament has to say about that. We learned what Jesus taught about it. And all of that has been in preparation to see how Paul is going to apply that teaching to his situation. And so when it comes to marriage, we learn that there are at least 4 purposes of marriage as they are stated here in the Old Testament. 1, it is for companionship in life. Number 2, it is for partnership in mission. Number 3, it is for procreation and reproduction. And last of all, it is a picture of the ultimate purpose of life, which is the union of God and human beings for all of eternity. Human marriage anticipates the divine marriage. Just as you have 2 different kinds of beings, a man and a woman, who come together in one union, that is a picture of, in the end, 2 different kinds of beings, human beings and God, coming together in a union, and marriage is meant to be a preview and a picture of that. From there, we went on through the rest of the Old Testament to see what it teaches about divorce and remarriage, and it doesn't teach much, actually. It anticipates that marriage between a man and a woman is for life, and so there are actually no specific laws pertaining to divorce. Now, the law does assume that divorce will happen, and it's a concession on God's part. And it demands that if a person gets divorced and remarried, they are not to go back to their original spouse if their second spouse dies or divorces them. There was no divorce for adultery in the Old Testament because the penalty for adultery was death. However, there was an exception clause that was later developed because the Jews were no longer allowed to put people to death. And so an exception clause was created so that you were not stuck in a unfaithful marriage. From there, we went on to look at Jesus' teaching, and we saw that he confirmed all this. He takes a pretty strict position on marriage, divorce, and remarriage in Matthew 5 and Matthew chapter 19. And we also discussed the fact that in doing this, Jesus was not trying to create laws that would crush people, but he was really trying to address what was a very casual attitude among the religious leaders of that time, which were allowing divorce and remarriage to happen for any and every reason. And so Jesus was saying to them, the practical result of your views on this is there's just adultery happening everywhere. And Jesus was trying to push back against that. So with that in mind, we finally then moved into 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and saw how Paul has addressed this subject. First, he noted that there was nothing wrong with marriage and with the sexual union within marriage. Partners should willingly give themselves to one another unless there's some pressing reason not to. To those who are married to a fellow believer, he says they're to stay in the marriage, not to get divorced, and if they do get divorced, they are to remain single. For those who are widowed or who were married and divorced before they became believers, they are allowed to remarry, but only in the Lord, which means a fellow believer. And then for those who come into the Christian faith, but their spouse remains an unbeliever, or perhaps if their spouse falls away, they are to stay in the marriage so long as their unbelieving spouse is willing to stay in the marriage. But if the unbeliever wants out, they are not bound in that particular situation. They are free to remarry. Okay? So as we move into today's text, Paul is now going to take up 3 more categories. He's dealt with 3 categories already. He's going to take up 3 more categories. But the main thrust of the teaching today is going to be the general principle that guides Paul in all of his advice. And we're going to look at those 3 categories today, but what we really want to spend most of our time on here this morning is that principle. And once that principle is adequately understood, then the 3 remaining categories, I think, will fall into place. And those 3 categories are virgins who have never been married, those who are currently engaged to be married, and then he'll actually come back with one more comment about widows. And we're not going to need a lot of time for reflection on those 3 categories, so we're going to spend the most of our time reflecting on the principle that is applied here. So that's our plan. And you can see from our handout that I've broken down today's lesson under 3 different headings. There is the principle given, then the principle explained, and the principle applied. And you're going to notice as we go through this, we're actually going to go slightly out of order from the way the verses are presented today, because Paul actually kind of weaves in and out of this. He's going to give the principle, then he's going to give an application, then he's going to go back and explain the principle further, and then he's going to come back and give 2 more applications. And I thought rather than weave through that, we'll just take it one thought at a time, and we'll save the application for the end. Okay? Before I take us into that, I've tried to distribute, but there's a little heavier on this side. Does everybody have a handout that wants a handout? Anybody need one? Welcome to raise your hand if anybody. Okay. All right, so let's talk about number 1, the principle given. Now, I opened up the lesson by talking about the fact that sometimes when you have great men of history, like Fred, for example, as he was talking about, and like the Apostle Paul, sometimes they can be a little hard to understand. Is that right, Fred? Is that what you're saying? Right. Yes, okay, all right. And the difficulty can come from the fact that sometimes, number 1, they think in ways that's a little bit hard for us to follow and understand. That's what we were seeing in our Romans text here this morning. But also, they think in ways and they have an intensity of purpose that some of us have trouble having ourselves, okay? I don't think you need to feel guilty about that, by the way. God gives us all our own mission, our own various temperaments, and the world would probably be kind of a miserable place if everybody was like the Apostle Paul, okay? There would be no comedy, okay, or anything like that. It would just be very serious about everything. But at the same time, we need great men like Paul to kind of lift our eyes above our general situation to remind us there are bigger and more important things going on here, and we might easily overlook them because we are often primarily concerned with our own comfort level, with settling into a very comfortable position. And if we didn't have men like Paul to kind of spur us on, we would probably rest there pretty easily. And so we're going to find something a little bit similar at work in our passage here today. As I mentioned earlier, Paul is going to show a principle that lies behind everything that he's teaching here on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And you may find as we study it here, this is a little bit foreign to you, even if you're probably going to recognize the truth of what he's talking about. So I've noted the outline for you. We're looking at the principle given. And for the first few verses, let's just take some time to understand what is the principle that he's talking about. Look at verse 17. He actually states it pretty succinctly here in verse 17. And it's on the back of your handout if you need it. Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule that I lay down in all the churches. Now, this is kind of an interesting principle. One of the things that you learn from Paul and his writing is Paul's concern is not primarily the comfort level of my life and yours. Okay? Now, I wouldn't say he's completely unconcerned about it, as if he's callous. But when you consider how much he gave up, how much he suffered on behalf of bringing the gospel to these people, Paul's main concern is not now how to just make everything comfortable for you. His primary concern is faithfulness, and his second concern is that you honor God in the place where God has you, in the time in which he has given you, for a specific reason. Paul's going to say to us, these are not accidents, as much as they may feel like it to you. These are works of providence. God has placed each one of us where he wants us to be, with the gifts that we have, with the experiences that have formed and shaped us, so that we can be used for kingdom purposes. Nothing in your life goes wasted if you are a child of God. Okay? Now, if you'll either look in your Bible or on the back of your handout, I'll show you a passage of Scripture that says something similar to this point in Acts chapter 17. It comes from Paul's speech to the Athenians. And Athens, of course, is just one city over from Corinth. It's just next door. Corinth is where Paul went after he went to Athens. And I want you to notice what Paul says to the Athenians. Verse 26. From one man he made all nations that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him, though he is not far from any one of us. All right, Paul's talking about the nations here, but of course nations are composed of individuals. And he's saying he has selected the appointed times and the boundaries where they live. We don't know how God does that. It's one of the mysteries of his providence and how it interacts with our free will. But Paul says that is exactly what has happened. God has determined when you live, where you live, at what time you live, and none of your life is wasted in how he develops this for you. And because that is true, if you come back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 17, the general principle is you should stay in the position where the Lord has called you. As a matter of fact, not only does he say you should stay in that position, he says the Lord has assigned you that position. And I checked various different translations, and they all had the same word there. The Lord has assigned you the place where you are. And we naturally kind of balk against this because we think, I'd very much like to assign myself my place, thank you very much, right? And that's the way that we usually are. But that's not in our prerogative. We belong to God, and he can place us where he wants us, when he wants us, for whatever purpose he desires. Okay? Now, even though Paul's overall subject here in chapter 7 is marriage and everything related to it, as he explains this principle to us, he's actually going to use two illustrations that have nothing to do with marriage that shows us how the principle applies in our particular life or in somebody's life. For example, in verse 18, he uses this illustration. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not become circumcised. Now, when I first read this, I have to admit, I kind of thought Paul was just throwing this out there and hadn't really thought it through all that well, okay? That he was just kind of, just kind of using an illustration, but he wasn't trying to be real tight with his point here. Because in today's world, while I have no doubt that there is probably some medical procedure out there that can reverse a circumcision, okay, in the ancient world, I was a little bit puzzled about how exactly that could happen. And I just assumed that Paul was kind of using an illustration here that didn't really have any meaning. Well, I should have known better, right? Paul doesn't ever just throw anything out there that doesn't have any meaning behind it. As I did some of my commentary work this week, apparently this was actually a real thing in the ancient world. Not only could an uncircumcised man become circumcised, I knew that was possible, of course, but there's also a practice in the ancient world that allows for the reversal of that particular surgery. Now, why would anyone want to do that? I would imagine there's not a long list of volunteers, okay? But the Jews, some Jews, felt pressure to fit into the broader Roman culture that they were part of. Probably not in Jerusalem, probably not right in Judea where they were surrounded by their own people, but out in what we call the diaspora, that is, those who are spread out. They felt the pressure to conform to Roman Gentile life. And I'll spare you the details of how the surgery was accomplished, okay? But it really was something that happened back then. So, all right, so what's Paul's point? His point is circumcision's not really an issue. It doesn't matter if you are or you aren't when it comes to your relationship with God under the new covenant. So if you're a Jew, don't try to live like you're something other than a Jew. If you're a Gentile, don't try to live like you're anything other than a Gentile. Live as God made you to be in the place where He put you. There's a reason you are who you are, and God put you where He put you. Okay? Now, the second illustration is going to be a bit harder to swallow and maybe even a little bit offensive given the historical context of our nation. Look at verse 21. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Isn't that interesting? Although, if you can gain your freedom, do so. For the one who was a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's freed person, and similarly, the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become willingly, meaning slaves of human beings. Brothers and sisters, each person as responsible to God should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Now that is a little shocking, isn't it? Paul says, stay in the situation where God called you. Now, Paul's not been through the history we've been through, but I also want to remind you what I said earlier, and that is Paul's primary concern is not the comfort level of our lives. Paul's teaching here in 1 Corinthians is consistent of what he will say in a number of different letters, in Titus, in Ephesians, and in other places. Slaves should not rebel against their position in the Lord. Now, he will say that if they are able to get their freedom, certainly they should take the opportunity to do it. But many of them couldn't get out of it, and so they should live faithfully in the place where the Lord has called them. God has a purpose for them right where they are. Now, if we had more time this morning, we could go into the fact that slavery in Rome was quite a bit different than slavery as we knew it in the United States. It was not based on race. And some slaves actually lived very well in Roman homes. I mentioned that book that I was reading earlier this morning about the life of the Apostle Paul. One of the things that she does a very good job at in that book is to detail what the life of slaves was like in many cases. And it was often true that for slaves in the Roman households that were in the patrician class, the slaves often had a higher education, a higher standard of living, because they used the slaves to train their own children, to give them an education, than people who were free but were non-citizens of Rome. So many slaves actually lived a higher standard of living than many Jews did, who were free, even though they were not, many of them, Roman citizens. So you have to keep all that in mind as Paul's talking about slavery. It was a little more complex situation than what we found in our own historical context. Any comments about the principle given here before we move on to a further explanation of it?
So it might be similar to Daniel and his friends when they were brought to Babylon.
Yes.
In a way, they were slaves. They had to do whatever was told.
That's right.
But there's how they were living and so on. I mean, they were given a chance to eat the best food, the king's food.
Yeah.
And a lot of people wouldn't have that in that kingdom where they were brought.
Yeah.
So it's a similar practice in many cultures back then.
Yeah, that's right. And Daniel and his friends did their best to live in the situation in which God had placed them. They were faithful there, and they were unwilling to be disobedient to God, as in the statue of Nebuchadnezzar. But they were not rebel rousers. They were not. They accepted the situation they were in and lived there. Yeah. So good illustration. Anybody else? All right, so I mentioned we're going to go out of order as we look at this. I want you to come over now to verse 29, where Paul is going to give an explanation for the principle that he has just given us. In verses 25 through 28, Paul gives an application, and we're going to come back to that at the end of class. But first, I want you to see the general principle. Verse 29 begins by saying, "What I mean, brothers and sisters." And so Paul's indicating to us, listen, I'm about to explain to you the reason behind the principle that I've given you and the application I've given you. What I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. Here is the reason that Paul says the people should stay in the position they are in. He says the time is short. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, I think there are two ways that we can anticipate his meaning here. One sense is the sense in which Paul could say the same thing to any Christians in any time period in any place, and that is the return of Christ is always upon us. We do not know when it is going to happen. And on top of the reality of the return of Christ, any of our own deaths are imminent. It could happen at any moment. I would imagine that all those people who worked in that factory in Tennessee the other day didn't realize they were about to die very violently, but boom, it just happens that quick. That can happen for any one of us in many different situations. And so, because of the brevity of life, and because the Lord is returning to put an end to this evil age, Paul says, you should not put too much emphasis on your life as it is now. You are free to accept the place where the Lord has put you. You can accept the circumstances that the Lord has put you in. And he says your primary preoccupation should not be to change it. Now, if you can, fine. It's not that you shouldn't have any thought about it, but it should not be your primary preoccupation. Bloom where you are planted, in the condition in which God has called you, because the time is near. Now, this kind of goes back to how I was just saying earlier that Paul thinks so differently than many of us. It's probably true that in your mind, time doesn't feel all that short. Isn't that right? Life's pretty long. Life's kind of hard. Many things we'd rather not put up with, if at all possible. And so we give a lot of time and attention to bettering our station in life, me included in that, okay? But I do think we should pause and let Paul kind of reorient our thinking here a little bit. Life does seem long at times, and in the specific context, staying in that marriage may seem long, or staying single may seem long, or facing that desire to remarry may seem very pressing to us. But Paul is trying to put the course of our life in the perspective of eternity. Surely life does seem long at times, but in comparison to eternity, he says, it's really just a vapor that is here and gone. And Paul has confidence that God will enable you to live in the place where he has assigned you. Are you married to a fellow believer? Don't get divorced. Are you single? Don't necessarily get remarried. Are you divorced? Perhaps there's wisdom in remaining as you are. Now, these are not things that Paul binds on people. Very important to see that. But he at least wants you to consider the principle. Does God have a purpose for you where you are, as you are? Okay. But there is a second possibility to what Paul may be talking about when he says the time is short. Look back down at verse 26. I know we haven't covered that yet, but Paul says, because of the present crisis, I think it is good for a man to remain as he is. What's the present crisis that Paul's speaking of here? Well, we don't know for sure, but it seems Paul may be anticipating the persecution that is going to come upon Christians in the Roman Empire. Paul knows, as a general rule, those who live godly lives are going to be persecuted because their lives stand out in the midst of an ungodly world. And he knows that as Christianity grows and spreads in the Roman Empire, it is going to draw more and more negative attention to itself, and he is anticipating hard times are on the way. And I think that makes a lot of sense for why Paul would say being single could be a real advantage. He will go on to say in the next few verses that, if you're single, you can dedicate yourself fully to the Lord. But it's also true if you're single and persecution comes, you have a lot less to stress about. Okay? You don't have to worry about a spouse. You don't have to worry about your children. You don't have to worry about your spouse or children if you were to die or if you were to go to prison or something like that. You don't have to worry about them being put to death. And Paul, I think, is saying to them, because of the crisis that is coming, I think you're better off as you are. Or at least you ought to be considering it, because I want to spare you of trouble. Okay? A man who has to suffer on his own is one thing, but it's quite different whenever he has to endure the suffering of his spouse or his children. And I think that's very likely some of the emphasis of what Paul says in this section. So, verse 29. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not, those who mourn as if they do not, those who are happy as if they were not, those who buy something if it was not theirs to keep, those who use the things of this world as if not engrossed in them, for this world in its present form is passing away. Now, he doesn't mean if you're married you should act as if you're single. That's not his point, okay? What he does mean, however, is Christ is to come before all things, and your allegiance to Christ before all things, even in your marriage, believe it or not. And when it comes to everything else, we don't mourn like the rest of the world. Even our happiness we hold lightly, knowing all the heartache in the world. We do not hold to our possessions like everyone else does. You get to keep nothing, and only a fool spends his life trying to gain what he's not going to be able to keep. We need to live, Paul is saying, with more than just the present moment in mind. We are people who are going to live forever. And forever is a long time. The current part of your life is short in light of that. Now, I'm not going to give too much attention to verses 32 through 36, because we've already kind of commented on this before, but let me just read it for you so we can reaffirm what we've already said. Look at verse 32. I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs and how he can please the Lord, but a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or a virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim, is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you. Very important there. But that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. So Paul finds a distinct advantage in being single, and once again he demonstrates how he thinks a lot differently than us. A single person, whether it be a man or a woman, has the ability to dedicate their whole life to the Lord in undivided attention. And Paul thinks that's a wonderful thing. And there's a very purposeful existence in that. Okay? By necessity, a person who is married has their loyalties divided. And that's not a bad thing. It's just the nature of the case in that particular way. But Paul recognizes there are great advantages to being single if you have the gift to do it. Again, verse 35, I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. Very important to understand. It's not a restriction. It's just simply his own observation based on his own life, which is single, and he wants that to be a factor. Okay. So that's a little further explanation of the principle. Any thoughts or comments, questions on that? Has he convinced you? Wouldn't convince me. All right. We've got just a couple minutes left, so let's go now to the specific applications. We've seen the principle given, we've seen it explained, now we're going to see it applied. And really, it has been the principle behind everything that he's taught in this chapter. First application, verse 25. It is to virgins, or to those who have never been married. Now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord. In other words, the Lord never addressed this in his ministry, at least that was written down. But I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, that's what we were just talking about, I think it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you pledged to a woman that's engaged? Don't seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Don't look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life. And Paul says, I want to spare you of this. So pretty straightforward here. To those who have never been married, Paul says, based on his principle, stay as you presently are. Are you engaged? Okay, don't seek to end it. If you are single, don't seek necessarily to get marriage. It's okay if you want to get married, but Paul says, I would like to spare you some of the troubles of the married life. You don't know about any of those troubles, do you?
Do you think he was thinking about Peter?
Maybe. Yes, he might have been. He very well may have been. Skip over to verse 36. Paul will now speak to those specifically who are engaged. If anyone is worried that he might not be acting honorably toward the virgin that he is engaged to, and if his passions are too strong, and he feels like he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He's not sinning. They should get married. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion, but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So then, he who marries the virgin does right, but he who does not marry her does right. So when it comes to those who are already engaged, Paul's basically leaving their options open. If they cannot control their lust and are afraid they're going to act inappropriately, Paul says you should go ahead and get married. Once again, he's leaning on the fact that some people are given the gift of celibacy and some are not. And for those who do have that gift, who have good self-control, who feel no compulsion, that they've made up their mind that they do not want to marry, he says they too do the right thing in their situation. And Paul wants them to know that both the one who marries and the one who doesn't marry does what is right. His recommendation for the single life is not in any way meant to be binding. It is just his own opinion that is born out of his own experience. Okay. Then finally, verse 39, we really cover some ground that we've already covered. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. That's the same thing we saw in Romans 7 this morning. But if her husband dies, she is free to remarry anyone she wishes, but he must belong to the Lord. In my judgment, she is happier if she stays as she is. And I think I too have the Spirit of God. So again, some basic advice here based on the fact that the time is short. If your spouse has died, he says, I think you'd probably be just as well not remarrying. But he does not lay it upon them as a law. It is just his recommendation based on the present crisis as well as his own experience.